Today's episode, I'll be talking to Paul Kingsnorth. Now, I've been looking forward to this interview for a couple of weeks. Paul's a novelist, poet and writer and environmentalist. And we get into some really, really deep areas about education and creativity, which, as you know, that's probably something I'm really fascinated in. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the show. Today's episode, I'm going to be talking to Paul Kingsnorth. Paul, great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
No, it's lovely. Look, I've got a traditional first question, which is, what do you do?
What do I do? Well, the simple answer to that is that I write. That's what I've done forever, really, since I was a kid. And that's what I've attempted to make a living at as an adult, which I've mostly sort of done on and off. So really, I'm a writer, and I've written 9 books altogether, would you believe? Most of which seem to tell the same story. So that's the simple answer, but there's a lot of other stuff I've been up to as well. I've been an environmental activist, and I've started up a kind of arts and literary movement, and I've done bits of teaching here and there, and I've brought up a family, and I plant trees, all sorts of stuff really. But it does all kind of rotate around words, which I have tried to escape from several times, and I've never quite managed it yet.
Yes, words of a way of trapping and tricking.
Yeah, exactly, they do.
Snaring you, yes. So you've already said that you've always been fascinated by writing. What's your earliest sort of recollections of that, really?
Well, I suppose it starts with reading, doesn't it, really? It starts with books and stories, and I was always the kind of child who, if I got taken on a beach holiday, I'd be the one who kind of sat under an umbrella reading a book rather than run into the sea, which my parents would occasionally look like confused at me because I'd rather be reading Lord of the Rings in a tent than making a sandcastle. I mean, no, I like sandcastles too, but I've always been just fascinated by stories. It's interesting. I've got a daughter now. She's 13 now, so she's getting older, but for the last 10 years, I've seen her doing exactly the same thing. So I can see what it must look like from the outside. She just disappears into books all the time, stories. And that's exactly what I was like. So I suppose for everybody, and I've taught a lot of writers over the last few years, and it's often the same story. If you love reading books, at some point you're going to ask yourself, can I write one? If you love stories, you want to tell them. And I think it's worth just always remembering that stories are much older than books. Books are very new. Most people in the world probably still can't read them. Even people who can read them mostly don't. Actually getting your story through printed pages is a very new and strange thing in human terms, but telling stories is probably as old as humans. We've always done it. Different cultures have different patterns of stories that they tell, but we all tell stories. And it's impossible to escape from them all, and everybody needs them, actually. So I suppose I just loved stories, and I was particularly keen when I was young on fantasy, other worlds, a little bit of science fiction, although I'm not so keen on the science, but I'm happy to read stories set in space. So stories for me, I suppose, were a means of escape. Not that I had a terrible childhood or anything. I had nothing particularly to escape from, but I just loved doing it. So it starts there, really. And I can remember writing little stories when I was a child and bad poetry, and that just sort of escalated, really. And then I ended up trying to make a career for myself, behaving like a child, really, which is, there are worse things to do,
Yes. I actually try to encourage people to carry on being children by playing musical instruments. So
that's another great way to do it. My son is a great guitarist, and I've never had any musical talent at all. I've channeled it all into writing, but both of my children can play. And yeah, it's exactly that, isn't it? It's you're in touch with that little stream that's always inside you when you're a kid.
I think that is such an important thing, and that is definitely something. Because what you said about stories being obviously older than books, and we've always told stories, and that is something that I could just look at and go, Yeah, music, same thing. You know, it's a sort of a weird thing that we could actually capture sound for a little period of time. That you know, in our history, that we could actually capture sound.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing, isn't it?
It is.
And music and storytelling obviously go together. I mean, music, even without the lyrics, is a form of storytelling in a way, isn't it? It's a pattern that sort of draws something out of you, and then when you obviously, if you attach lyrics to it, you've got a whole other thing. And again, that's something extremely ancient. You know, singing is, who knows? I know there are theories that that's how we develop language through song.
Yes.
So this stuff is so old.
That sounds very true.
Stories are older than everything. No, stories are older than reason. They're older than civilization. They're older than technology, or at least modern technology. They're older than all the stuff we take for granted.
Yeah.
As long as there are humans, we'll be singing and telling stories and making up things around the fire.
So that's a really fascinating thing, because it's something that I've, with the various people that I've spoken to, it's often we've sort of skirted around that. But I've sort of been really intrigued by these things that really make us human, you know, the storytelling and the music and the art, the dance and all those sort of things that have seemed to be pushed aside in the education system in a lot of ways, you know, for something that's easily managed from the point of view of how you can write it onto a curriculum.
Yes.
Because, you know, the arts are a bit of a slippery subject, aren't they?
Well, it's tied up with the whole kind of civilizing process, which is really the other, I suppose, if that's what my writing ended up all being about. Because I've always had this, as well as loving stories, and this is probably very much related to me disappearing into kind of Middle Earth and various places when I was a kid. I've always just had this disappointed relationship with the modern world because I don't like it and I don't think it works, and I think it destroys the things that I value. Actually, the whole of the ethos, which is exactly replicated in the school system, which is one of the reasons we homeschooled our children, for example, is that, you know, the ethos of modernity is the ethos of growth and profit and technology and technique and everything that is mythic and poetic and natural, actually, and embedded and embodied in us is suppressed or removed or romanticized or ignored. And that really matters. And this stuff is always dismissed as romanticism and backwardness and reaction and all the rest of it. And it isn't actually. This is the stuff that humanity is made of.
Yeah.
And so actually what I ended up doing with my words is kind of exploring that sense of lostness that I have in what the world has become. And, you know, either there's just something badly wrong with me, which is entirely possible, or there's something badly wrong with the world, or both. Both could be true. But, you know, we have moved into a situation where we have alienated ourselves, I think, from culture, from nature, from our bodies, from ourselves, from our stories, and we know it as well, actually, on some level. And it's reflected in everything that's happening to the wider Earth. It's reflected in the changing climate and the extinction rates and the poisoning of the atmosphere and the kind of the sense of lostness that we have. The more modern a country is, the more lost people feel, I think. And it's just, so that's really exactly what I've always been looking at in my writing. And when you're kind of a young man, you think there must be a solution to that, and you can find it because you're so brilliant, if only you do enough reading and writing. So as you get older, you think, oh no, there isn't. This is a perpetual problem. But it's also something that's accelerating. And so I suppose if words can do anything useful for me in fiction and nonfiction, they've always been about trying to dig into what the break is. Where's the break? Where's the brokenness? What's wrong? What did we miss? Was there a point at which we went wrong, or is it just a perpetual sort of process of falling away and then having to come back again? I don't know the answer, but that's the reason I can't stop writing, I think.
That's really well put. You know, I've seen the same thing with the education system. Now, you obviously liked learning, or certainly liked reading. So what did you feel? Because I think this is obviously this is a driver to your creativity. What was it early on that you started to realize you didn't feel comfortable with? What was it?
Well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, I suppose I grew up with in a very normal way in a kind of English suburb in the south of England, with a very normal family. I suppose if there were, not that there is such a thing, but a family.
Okay,
And
yeah.
And it was fine. And we had, it was this, it was just a, you live in a suburban house, and your dad goes to work, and my mum was at home, although she started working later, and I went off to school, and so did my brothers. And my dad was from a kind of working class background. Both my parents were really, and they, and particularly my dad was very keen for me to sort of get on in life, go to university, do all the things because he'd never done that. So he felt like he'd missed out, and he was quite upwardly mobile. So he wanted his kids to sort of have the things he didn't have. He was very driven, and so he drove us quite hard. But there was something about the values that never clicked with me. I couldn't see them. I didn't believe in them. So I was brought up quite conventionally, and in some ways I'm still quite conventional actually, but there's always been this thorn in me, and I've thought I just didn't believe in the stuff that I was being taught. I didn't believe in, I've always thought that the values of business, which are the values that drive the culture, are just disgusting to me actually. The values of profit and the values of money and the values of commodifying and commercializing everything. And I think that's what it was, because I couldn't have put it into words when I was a child, but
no.
The world of Middle Earth does not have any, there's hardly any merchants in it, right? No one's commodifying anything. You can buy a bit of beer in the Shire, but actually the stuff that's going on is beyond that. And everything that I grew up with in Middle England, or just England generally, in the 80s and the 90s, and that was and still is, even more so now, it's just the commodification of everything, which is what capitalism does. Everything has to be drawn into the orbit of money. Yeah. And then that just makes people small and greedy, and the entire system that we operate within encourages us down that road, and it encourages us not to look at the other stuff that matters, and it tells us that the stuff that matters doesn't really matter, and it's romantic nonsense, and etc. So that was what it was, and I suppose I felt that for years and years, and I could never put my finger on what was wrong, and I was always made to feel stupid if I mentioned it. But I knew it was wrong, and I still do. I still am the same 13-year-old reading Lord of the Rings and thinking I can see what's wrong with the world, because that's fundamentally what it was. And I think it took me about 20 years to work that out, actually. Sorry, go on.
No, that's because you came up, you said something which I thought was like this business of commodification, because that's exactly what has happened with music. It's a commodity, and all the things that as a musician that music can do, from the point of view of it there being some sort of healing aspect to it, sort of seeing things of people who are mentally ill, people with Alzheimer's and stuff, having some contact with their own selves again after listening to music from their past. Okay, it might only be very fleeting, but there's something there that's extraordinary when you see it happening. And there's sort of self-confidence that a person gets by playing a musical instrument. And but the trouble is, it's become like something you can sort of buy, or something that you can just get this little certificate to say that you could do that thing, which is not really what I see being an artist or a musician or being a writer maybe is about. There's something about your identity being sort of reflected out in the world in a sort of a way. So I think that thing of all of music being a commodity, somebody's copyright on this, and all the lawyers move in to say you've nicked my song idea and all the rest of it, has killed it.
We're all content providers now, aren't we?
Yes.
So that's how it goes. You're a content provider, and you choose your platform, and you provide content on your platform. You see if you can get enough subscribers, and then maybe get an Instagram account and take some pictures of your dinner.
Yes, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
But I mean, that's just the microcosm of what's happened to the whole culture, because everything's commodified.
Yes.
And as an increasingly old geezer, I'm kind of Generation X. I'm nearly 50. It's sometimes hard for me to remember or to see how the really younger people have just grown up with this all around them all the time. The kind of always on Generation Z, whatever we're calling younger people, who are teenagers now. This is my daughter's generation, I suppose, or even younger than that. This stuff is just this is the water they swim in. Everything's commodified. Everything's about image. Everything's fake. And a lot of them know it as well.
Yes.
But it's even harder now than it was, say, 30 or 40 or however many years ago, to kind of see through it and to get away from it. It's this kind of total matrix of commerce and commodification everywhere. And like you say, it sucks everything in. Everything can be turned into content: education, healthcare, art, music, whatever, anything you can do. And stepping outside that is an act of rebellion. The greatest act of resistance today is just to not commodify something, I think, actually, or just to quietly do something creative.
Yeah. So how much of that do you think is the education system? Because
I think the education system exists because, the whole notion of schooling,
yes,
even Illich used to write a lot about this. I mean, the whole notion of schooling is produced by the Industrial Revolution, really, because the people families have been broken up, land has been enclosed, the population has been proletarianized, the men have been forced into the factories, and sometimes the women as well. So you've got to put the kids somewhere. So let's put the kids in a big building and teach them all of the things that modern industrial people think they need, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic, and all of the other kind of rational calculus-based things that they need to achieve what they need to achieve in the new market economy. So it's the marketization of anything. I think the whole education system exists for that basis. Maybe there was a brief period where education was a kind of seen as a general good for society, a sort of liberal with a small L general good, where people would learn things for the sake of learning them, which is ideally what it ought to be about.
Yes.
But I'm not sure it started that way, and it certainly isn't that way now. It's all the tests, and it's absolutely about. I mean, I'm very interested in this whole narrative of getting everyone into STEM. STEM's the big thing now, isn't it? Science, technology, education, and medicine, I think it is. And it's all about getting kids into tech, teaching them coding. And, there's a big push for women in STEM because we've got to get all the girls in there as well. And that's presented as liberation, but it's actually just a kind of equal opportunities enslavement, really.
Yes.
get everyone doing the same techie stuff. And even if you want to do, say, an arts degree or something, it's always seen as something which is, that's a bit pointless, really. And even the arts degrees now are just analyzing books in a kind of dead textual fashion that has nothing to do with actual creativity at all. The whole thing is broken, I think, but that's probably because the circumstances in which it was born were designed to take it in that direction. I really think the root of the whole education system, the whole notion of filling a building full of children for 10 years and getting the state to tell them what to think is it's not a good model, and it's a very unusual one in historical terms as well.
Well, the interesting thing is, for me, is if you wanted to subdue a population, whether that's the Turks doing it to the Greeks, or the English doing it to the Irish, or the native people being disavowed of everything. Education, wasn't it? It's always been education.
Yes. Well,
teach these people to think like we do.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's interesting about that, I mean, you mentioned the English in Ireland. Of course, one of the things that colonizers do is they take the language away from people. That's the first thing they do. And they say, learn our language instead because it's better. And obviously the English and British actually notoriously did that around the world. But the British did it in England too.
Yes,
they did it in Scotland too. They did it in Britain as well, right? Yes. So I mean, obviously that's what the whole notion of the Queen's English is about. You go into a school and you learn a certain elite dialect of English, and you stop speaking your Somerset dialect or your Essex dialect, or your stop using the words that your grand taught you around the fire or whatever, and you start using this word from a book because it's approved by the education masters. Yeah, absolutely. It's all part of the same system of funneling people into the market economy. You take them away from any roots they might have, any culture they might have, any community they might have, and you funnel them into, precisely that, the kind of the commercial matrix, and everything you do can then be commodified, and that is sold back to you as an achievement that you've got. I mean, there's part of me that doesn't like selling any of my writing. I mean, I do because I have to make a living, and I don't want anyone to steal it, ideally. but I mean, as I get older, I mean, I think, look, stories do. I mean, I don't know if they belong to everyone. Maybe they do. It's the whole process of even the process of writing a book is an act of commodification, because then you have to sell it to people because it costs money to make, and that's just the way it is. So we have to do that. But again, it's not really ideal. But as I say, it's the water we swim in. We're so caught up in it now that it's difficult even to imagine a future outside it, isn't it?
Yes. It's very, very difficult. So when in your sort of journey with writing, that you started to hone that side of your writing, or has that always been there? Or is there a moment you sort of thought, it was definitely this point when I was, whatever, 16 or whatever?
Well, in terms of the sort of
because
analysis of things.
Yeah, you've got an angle on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always a struggle in me between the creative writer and the kind of political writer,
Right.
which is a bit frustrating because I just wanted to, there's a poem that George Orwell wrote once when he was young that he reproduces in one of his essays. It's a very bad poem, but it's all about how he would have loved to have lived in the past and just been a vicar in a kind of Anglican vicarage, wandering around looking at his cherry trees and doing a sermon every Sunday. But he couldn't do that because he was born in the 20th century. So he's around in the age of Hitler and Stalin and the Spanish Civil War. So he has to be engaged in the world because he can't live that life anymore. So I suppose I've always felt like that in a way. So really, the part of me that would like to write, I mean, what I really wanted to do when I was young was be a great poet, which is never going to happen because I'm not great at poetry, but also it's not an age for poets. We don't have any great poets in Britain. And since Ted Hughes died, there are no great poets, and there are none in Ireland either. And that's quite interesting to me. That's quite telling. I don't think we know how to do that art form anymore. But I wanted to maybe be a poet, maybe a novelist. But really, if I trace the sort of politicization of things back, I suppose it's really going to university. So my dad was very keen for me to go to university so I could kind of have a good career and get a good start. And I ended up getting to Oxford University, which I didn't expect to do. I sort of almost applied for fun and then got in, much to my own surprise and the surprise of my teachers, who didn't expect me to get in because I was very average. But I did.
Obviously you weren't.
Well, I don't know. It's a weird thing. There were some people in my school who were expected to get to Oxford and they didn't. And I did. I kind of came out of barriers. Nobody looked. It was like the tortoise and the hare. So I got in. Then I thought to myself, shit, I've got into Oxford. This is going to be humiliating because it's going to be full of hugely intelligent people from private schools. And I'm going to just look like an oik. But I got there and there are definitely some very smart people at Oxford, but actually you find that most of them are just not much cleverer than you. And also that all the people from public schools are just good at bullshitting, which pretty much, that's the skill.
True.
It's true. This is where
I've taught in a few public schools.
I think it's the major skill they learn, and this is what gets the likes of Boris Johnson where they are. It's just that kind of confidence and that sense that they know they're going to inherit the earth. When I was at Oxford, I saw I was there at the same time as William Rees-Mogg, actually, who I only saw him once or twice in like the bar somewhere, and I said, "Who is that?" And he looked then exactly like he looks now. He looked like a Tory squire from 1920, but he knew he was going to inherit the earth. He just emanated that feeling. You've got to have a sort of grudging respect for that. But that's So anyway, I'm getting distracted. So I went to Oxford, surrounded by all these posh people, and I realised I wasn't as thick as I thought I was, which probably gave me a bit more confidence. And then, partly being surrounded by that sort of that complacent poshness made me a bit politicised, I think, because I thought it's really not fair that these people come from this gilded life and are clearly going to be cabinet ministers in 20 years' time, not through any skill of their own.
No.
And there's a lot of people out there who could do a better job and they ain't going to get there. So there was partly that. And I come from quite a lower middle class family, I suppose. It's very ordinary, not posh, not poor. So I suppose I probably was a bit chippy about that. But mainly, I mean, I'd grown up not only with a love of fantasy books, but a love of nature. And I used to go on long walks across the mountains with my dad, and all of my family used to go camping. We all loved the kind of the wild world, if you like. So I had, that had a real impact on me, just camping on mountains for weeks on end. And back in the 80s, there were no smartphones. So when you went up a hill, you were really up a hill. There was no communicating until you found a phone box every couple of days. So I had a real relationship with nature. And when I went to college in the early 90s, there was a real activist movement going on around road building. The road protest movement was happening. And there was just generally a big upsurgence in direct action and a kind of quite radical environmentalism, not the sort of corporate variety you get now, but a real sort of let's protect the landscapes, let's protect the forests, let's stop this road being built. So I got involved in that really, and that very much politicized me. And I realized that nature that I had, basically the spiritual experiences I was having in the natural world were under threat because the natural world was. And when you start pulling on that thread, you start examining the whole system that we're living in, and you say, well, why are we building these roads here? Why are we taking this forest down? Why are we expanding endlessly? What's the deal here? What's the system we're living under? And then, then you start thinking about capitalism and industrialism and growth and progress and all of the big stuff. And I've been thinking about them ever since, really, because I think we're, like I said, I think we're in a kind of spiral of destruction that comes from our own appetites and the system we're living in. And I don't have a political solution to that at all. And it's usually quite dangerous to look for one in some ways, in a grand scheme of things, because they usually make things worse. But that just fed my sense that we're living in a way that is extremely wrong here. You don't have to believe in the ability to create utopia to see that a society that does this to the natural world and rips its people away from any kind of culture and commodifies the whole thing has got some big problems, and they're really deep problems. They're not just about technology or the wrong kind of fuel going into the power stations or something. This is entirely a relationship that's completely out of whack that we've got. So really, I've just obsessed about that in different ways for 25 years. I think there are two different kinds of writers in the world. This is my theory about literature. My grand theory of literature is that there are two types of writers. There's a kind of writer who can tell a lot of different stories, and they just love writing, and they're good at writing, and they like to tell stories. And then there are other writers who just keep telling the same one. They just can't stop it, and they may tell it in a lot of different forms, but they have one story to tell, and maybe they're more limited. And I'm that second kind of writer. I've just got one thing I've been saying forever, which is about this broken link between us and nature, which I think is a spiritual crisis. And I've just, even when I try to write something else, that ends up writing itself through me, which is sometimes a bit annoying, but it happens. So that's really where it started, I think.
So when you started you became an activist, did it make everybody panic?
Yeah, well, it wasn't on my dad's agenda. See, he sent me off. Sent me off to university to become a lawyer or a doctor, and I ended up becoming a sort of green anarchist who wanted to take the system down. So we had a tense relationship for a while, shall we say? It wasn't in the plan. But my mum was much more sympathetic to it on the quiet. She is much more sensitive to these things than my dad was. My dad's dead now, but he was very much a driven career man. So he loved nature as well. He was the one who took me on these mountain walks, but it wasn't supposed to get in the way of your career. You got to get your priorities right. So but I had my priorities all wrong. So there was a bit of father and son tension for a while. But I don't know. I wanted to work out a way of sort of saving the world, if you like, and writing at the same time. And I thought, well, writing could be a tool of doing that. So for quite a while, I was an activist writer in that sense. I was using the words to do particular things that I hope they could be useful for. Which is, there are worse ways to spend your 20s, I suppose. Yeah.
So how did you, I'm searching for the words here. You said you were a recovering activist. When did you realize that this wasn't really, there was something problematic with the way that things like activism was working?
Well, I think it's just a common realization, isn't it? You're young and fiery and you want to change the world, and you get involved in some sort of activist work, whatever it is, whatever your politics. And when you're young, you're quite both arrogant and largely ignorant of the world. So that's a bad combination, but entirely normal for young men. So you've got a sort of ambition, I don't know, it's the kind of energy that makes things happen in a way. Not always good things, but it does make things happen. So I wanted to save the world, and I did lots of stuff. And some of these forms of activism are good, and they do good stuff. But altogether, if you're looking at the human attack on the rest of nature, and you're looking at the things that are proposed by activists to stop it, which are always inadequate, and the basic willingness of most of the culture to do anything, which is not very willing at all, then you have to say to yourself, well, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And for a long time, you sort of deny that to yourself because you don't want it to be true, but then eventually you sort of have to accept it. And I suppose that was what happened to me. There were a couple of things that happened. Firstly, but when it came to things like climate change and extinction and the rest of it, you know, we were putting out endless messages about how we only had 100 months to save the Earth and the rest of it. And you get all these numbers coming out, and then 100 months would pass and the Earth would still be here and no one would have done much. And then you just say, well, we've only got another 100. It sort of goes on a bit. So you've got this message that no one's listening to. You've got a message that isn't realistic and is a bit hyperbolic as well. But you've also got a machine that is not going to stop. You know, this global economy, whatever we call it, is not going to stop. A lot of people like it. Most people are dependent on it, including all the environmentalists and me and you. This is where we are. So we're caught in this bind where we can see the destruction, but we're dependent on the destruction. We don't really know how to leave it. There's no grand scheme to stop it. Even if there was, it would turn into a hideous Stalinist style tyranny if we tried to create a sort of eco regime to save the world. Can you imagine how terrible that would be?
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
It's just so, you know, with the best will in the world, you're caught in a situation where you say, I don't know what to do and this isn't going to work. And when you start to say that, you become a little bit unpopular amongst other activists. Although, to be honest, these days, a lot of activists are saying it too, because it's obviously true. So it was just partly that. But the other thing that was happening was that environmentalism was being commodified as well. It was being caught up. Capitalism is great at absorbing all of its critics. It always does that. So whether you're communism or socialism or, you know, the civil rights movement or environmentalism or whatever, feminism, capitalism will get you and sell you back to yourself, right? So this is what environmentalism has done. Environmentalism now has been completely neutered. The word green is used by every corporation on Earth and every government on Earth, and it's used just to refer to carbon reduction. So the whole of environmentalism has been reduced to let's reduce carbon emissions. And when we've done that, we can just have a future in which the cars are electric instead of diesel, and the power stations are running on solar or nuclear instead of coal, and hooray, hooray. So we can get on with the general project of low carbon commodification of everything on Earth. And that's what environmentalism has become very crudely in the mainstream. Still lots of good environmentalists and activists and green people around, mostly at local level. But the project itself, environmentalism, was supposed to be a radical challenge to the values of the right and the left, actually. It was supposed to be a radical challenge to the values of consumer capitalism and the values of a kind of materialist, statist left, which was very dominant back in the day. But it's not really either now. It's been absorbed. And so I suppose I just faced the reality that it wasn't working. And so I said, where does that leave us? You know, as writers and as artists and as people, how do you deal with that reality? Which is quite, you know, it was quite difficult for a few years to just sit with that. I wasn't the only one who thought that, but I think a lot of people were not and still are not prepared to really accept it, because people are frightened of falling into despair, you know, understandably, because that's where it can lead you if you're not careful.
Yes, it can.
And then when you say it, which I did, then obviously a lot of people anyway, will come out and accuse you of being a doomer or a depressive, you know, person who needs to be quiet or needs to have therapy or something. So you know, I do understand their reaction, but that was where I found myself.
I think you know, sort of obviously as you get older, you start looking at things and listening to people, and you think, I've heard all of this before, and it's just a load of nonsense, you know. And and it didn't work then, and you realise that, you know, the same yarn is being spun to people, maybe with a little bit of a different sort of dressing up. It's more or less the same thing, you know. That old thing, we'll have a cure for this, we'll have this out, and this will happen.
Oh, yeah.
And it's all nonsense, you know. And always, using a musical metaphor, I always go back to the first time I saw the CD on, well, it was, first of all, it was on Blue Peter, and then a couple of hours later, it was on Tomorrow's World, extolling how wonderful the CD was.
Was this when they spread the jam on it?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember spreading. You can even spread jam on it. It's so tough. Yes.
Exactly. And of course, it was a load of old nonsense.
I've tried it, and my CDs are ruined. Yeah.
It was complete nonsense. And I just think that, to me, was such a great metaphor for all of the things that we're told, you know, about how much time we're all going to have because of computers and machines. We're going to be doing taking all the hard work, and we now have all this leisure time. And it's nonsense.
Well, nuclear power's back. Have you noticed nuclear power's back at the moment because the electricity grid's collapsing? So
Yes.
nuclear is going to save us, just like it was in the 1950s when it
Yep.
was going to give us electricity too cheap to meter. Any moment now, nuclear fusion is coming around the corner as well. That's just about to come off the grid, and it is exactly the same thing. It's the techno. It's called the progress trap. I wrote an essay about this years ago.
Right. Yeah.
Term that was coined by who was it? I've forgotten the name of the man who wrote a book called A Short History of Progress. He's another writer, and he coined this notion of the progress trap, where you invent a technology which is useful in the short term, but it traps you into dependence on it, and then it creates more problems, and then you need more technology to solve those problems. So that's basically that's where we are, and that's why everything gets faster all the time, everything gets tighter all the time, and more controlled, and you feel like you're in a sort of closing trap all the time, because you're more and more monitored, you're more and more controlled. There's less and less you can say, there's less and less you can do that isn't sold back to you, and that's the system. But all the time, the whole narrative, of course, is about how liberated you are. Lucky old you can get an Alexa in your house and she'll record your conversation and send it to Mark Zuckerberg. So lucky old you, but you do get a pizza delivered without having to get up. So hooray.
Exactly. I mean, going back to the sort of nature connection thing, if you look at nature, everything's biodiversity, weird and wacky things that don't appear to go together sort of do go together. Because here everything we do sort of predicated on one thing, whatever that one thing is, with the GPS system. You've got loads of things locked into the GPS system. You think, what's that got to do with GPS? What's the international banking got to do with GPS? And you think, like, but it seems that that's what we do. We invent something, and then everything has to revolve around that one thing. And that just seems to me like a recipe for disaster. At some point in time, we're going to realize that actually that doesn't work.
Well, when the GPS system stopped working, of course, then we've all forgotten how to learn how to read maps. And, learning how to read maps meant that we forgot how to read the landscape.
Exactly.
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it is that type of. We keep doing it over and over again.
Well, we like ease. We all like ease, don't we? We like to have something done quickly for us. And the more the progress trap tightens around us, the more we need things done quickly for us, because we're always in such a hurry. If we can get a bit of tech that will do something that we were previously doing. Robot lawnmowers is my favorite current example. These are great. You spend thousands on these, and they just go around your front garden doing something you could do yourself in 10 minutes, but you don't have to go outside. So that means you can spend more time answering all the emails you don't want to get. And looking at screens at things you don't really need to look at.
No, exactly.
Every single bit of that generates content, and you are being harvested all the time. I mean, this is the key thing, right? This stuff doesn't exist for no reason. That you're giving all your information over, you're being tracked, you're being watched, you're being monitored, you're being turned into a consumer good, and all your desires are being harvested, and then things are being sold back to you. It's so everything's commodified, including you. Ultimately, all your secret little desires on the internet are all going somewhere.
Yes,
and everybody knows everything we're up to. So
yes, I know.
So yeah, it's but it's we like it.
So with your writing then, Paul, what did you just go? Did you go into journalism first, or what was the?
I did. I actually decided I was going to try and become I don't know why I decided this. I think it was my dad pressuring me to get a real job. I decided I should go and work in Fleet Street or something. So I wrote letters to all of the newspaper editors. This is back in the 90s when we still had newspapers. And one of them said, I need a researcher. It was the Independent. I need a researcher. Why don't you come and try that out? So I went off and worked as a kind of researcher on the Independent for about 9 months, which was fine. It did teach me some things. It was interesting, but it was basically also, I was no good at it. I realized I was not going to be a journalist because I didn't like it. And I didn't care enough to do the research properly. And because I didn't care about the news agenda at all, I didn't care about things I was supposed to be reporting on. So I was having to spend my day researching stories I didn't care about or believe in. And this was in the day before the internet as well. So you had to do proper research. You had to get on the tube and go off to a library and find some old book with some facts in, or you had to ring people up rather than just reading their Twitter feed and copying it onto the page. You had to do interviews, go out and see what's going on. So that was actually quite useful. I did learn a little bit about how to do kind of old-fashioned journalism, but I wasn't much good at it, and it wasn't for me. So I didn't last very long, and I ended up going off and working for a little campaign group, which probably doesn't exist anymore, called Earth Action, which was in London. And they needed a writer to write their campaign packs. So I did that, and I thought, this is brilliant. I get to be an environmentalist and an activist and a writer at the same time, which I did for a couple of years. And I enjoyed that. So that was, again, this was before the internet. So we used to write these kind of action packs and post them out to people around the world, and they'd all take action at once. So that kind of felt useful. And then after that, after a few years of doing that, I thought, well, I wonder if I can go freelance and write environmental stories and be an activist at the same time. I was still getting involved in a lot of anti-globalization activism and road protest stuff and environmental stuff all over the place. So I did that. Then I ended up somehow working at the Ecologist magazine, and I ended up being deputy editor of that. And this is all back in the 90s, really. So it all, I managed to make a living writing activist work about things I believed in, which was really nice. So and it was an interesting time to be doing it. The anti-globalization movement was rising, and environmentalism was quite influential. So it was kind of a good time. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, and all that.
Yeah, it was an interesting point in time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was. I don't know. It almost felt like a sort of slightly second-hand sort of 60s moment in a way. Maybe it's like things felt like they could actually change. It felt like a bit. Maybe I was just young and naive, but it felt like the values of things might shift, which they did, but in the wrong direction. I think it felt like there was a little crack in history opening up a little bit there.
I was going to say, because I think once we got into the 2000s, or the noughties, or whatever people called it, God knows, and then obviously you had the Twin Towers and everything, people's focus became something else.
Yes, well, I think in Britain, after we elected Tony Blair, we all got had there.
Yes,
I think we all looked at Tony and we thought, oh, here's a young, fresh, sort of leftish sort of man. But it turned out he was a ravening neoliberal in disguise who was going to bust the whole place open to international capital and then start a war. That's what he did.
Yes.
So there was kind of no way back. I mean, it's globalization really accelerated, over the last 20 years, in not just in the West, obviously, but everywhere. In a way that probably, I don't know. Certainly, I wasn't paying attention to, but it's almost like it's having to run to keep up with itself.
Yes.
It's almost unstoppable at this point until it falls
apart. Well,
apart.
Of course, you've got, I can't remember, there's a sort of a Hindu story, isn't there, about this monster that eats itself. And you just end up, you just end up with this mouth.
Yes, it's looking like that.
Well, it is interesting that I can't see how it can stop.
No, well, I mean, that's the thing that I sort of came to see is it's not going to stop until it's stopped, and it's not going to be stopped by people stopping it, because not enough of us want to, and we don't know how to. It's going to be stopped when it hits the buffers.
Exactly.
It's going to be stopped when the supply chains crack, which they're starting to do, and it's going to be stopped when the ecological situation, makes it impossible to do certain things, and it's going to stop when the debt is so monstrous that it can't pay any of it back anymore, which may not be very long until that happens either. So it's just, it's a literally unsustainable system.
Yes.
And so it can't be sustained. But obviously when it comes, when things like that come apart, all sorts of hideous things can happen. You don't know it's not possible for me to look at the kind of the future of the globalized commercial machine and say, well, this is going to end well. It's not going to end well. It's going to end really, really badly for a lot of people. So that's that was kind of where I got to in terms of my writing. So that changed my direction a little bit.
So when did you leave the I can't remember what you said.
The Ecologist.
The Ecologist.
Well, I wrote a book in 2001, which came out in 2003, and it was called One No Many Yeses, and it was a anti-globalization book. And I did a world tour. I went to a lot of places where there were resistance movements: Mexico, South Africa, America, Italy, Indonesia. It was great, actually. It was an amazing thing to be able to do. And I wrote that. I left the Ecologist to write that book. That was my first activist book. And while I was writing that book, the 9/11 happened. In fact, it happened while I was in Mexico waiting to go to America. I was actually due to get on a plane to New York the day after 9/11. So luckily I was booked on the right day. But that kind of changed everything. So by the time the book came out, no one was paying any attention to globalization anymore, because it was all Islam and the Iraq War, and everything had kind of shifted in the media. But that was what that was what led me in that direction, I suppose. And then a few years later, I wrote another book called Real England, which was it was about England, and it was about the same forces, the same forces of kind of globalization, homogenization, corporate power, but it was about their impact on England, my country, the local communities there, and people's power and ability to run their lives there. Because the point being that this stuff is happening everywhere. It's not just happening in the poor world; it's happening to everything. Everything's bought and sold wherever you come from. And that's a cultural loss. Wherever you are, wherever you come from, wherever you are, there's a cultural loss involved in that, because the ability of communities to actually create cultures at local level anywhere is taken away. Everything's commodified, everything's sold back to you. You can't compete against a giant corporation that's coming from the other side of the world. You can't compete against the EU's trade laws or the government's trade laws, whatever it is. You haven't got a chance against that. So wherever you are, that process of homogenization and dependency really is created. So that was, I was just trying to examine that and tell people about it, I suppose, because it just really upset me. So I wanted to write about it. It still does. It's still obviously still happening. So
yes, yeah. So was the second book, but obviously wasn't completely under the shadow of the Twin Towers. So
no, the second book
must have got a bit more.
No, it did quite well. It got quite good reviews. Interestingly, right across the board, it was got good reviews in the Guardian and the Telegraph. So which was good, because what I was trying to do with it was take these issues out of the boring left-right ding dong and say, look, this is culture. It belongs to everybody. It's got nothing to do with what you think your tribe is. This is wherever you live, this is happening. And deliberately in the book went to quite different places. Like I looked at the commercialization of Chinatown, and then I went to Newham Market, which is the most multicultural market in London and in Europe, where they were trying to develop and gentrify it. And then I was also in kind of small traditional pubs and boatyards and old farmhouses. It's so kind of, all this stuff is so cross-cultural, because wherever you are, it's going to be flogged off from under you if it possibly can be. So that's obviously that's still the case, but there's a lot more awareness of it now than there was then. People are, I think, again, right across the spectrum, it's increasingly hard to fool people about this process, because we don't feel free, and we don't feel like progress is working, and we don't look around us and go, oh, it's not the 1950s or the 60s anymore. It's not possible for us to go, oh, don't worry, technology or science will save us, because they manifestly won't, and we don't believe it anymore. I mean, you see this with COVID. It's quite interesting, this kind of screaming about how we all have to trust the science all the time. Wouldn't be happening if we trusted science. You don't endlessly need to tell people to trust you if you're trustworthy.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like it's very clear that there's trust is breaking down in almost every institution.
And I also think that people are very skeptical about data.
Yes, well, they are, because it's been used upon people for so long now, and it still is clearly being manipulated, and the conversation is so obviously directed, and some things can be said and some things can't. And as soon as you're doing that, people don't trust you. Of course they don't trust you. If you've got a controlled conversation and only some things are acceptable and other things are going to get you thrown out of the charm circle, you can't run a society like that. Whatever your opinions are, you don't want to live in that culture, because you don't know when you've crossed the line. So it's these are the kind of things that I think societies and cultures do when they're really starting to fall apart. They have to really clamp down. Authoritarianism starts rising when you can't control the narrative and you can't control people, because it doesn't. There's a kind of general loss of faith, and that's how it feels to me now. People can feel the breakdown. I mean, we're one economic crisis away from something very bad indeed. If we got another 2008 at this point, it would not be nice. So this is all very gloomy, isn't it? But
well, it is. I've often said that we're sitting on so many little time bombs just waiting.
Yeah, I think
just
so.
ticking away. And the trouble is, like a lot of these things, you can't predict them, and you can't predict the actual way that they will unfold either, because they're sort of slightly unknowable. But the trouble is, if we keep doing, I heard Stephen Fry quote somebody talking about, if you had this piece of perspex and a load of mice on it floating on a massive tank of water, it would be fine. But if you scaled it up and put humans on a piece of perspex, it would sink, because suddenly people would be running around trying to make it be safe.
Mm.
And I think there is an element of the fact that, like you said, as soon as you try to fix something, it just manifestly will go wrong.
Yeah, well, look, once you get up to, it's a question of scale as well, isn't it? Once you've created a system that's so complex,
yeah.
Once you've got an enormously complex society like this one, I mean, the supply chains are a great example at the moment. They're so complex.
Yeah.
One thing goes wrong, like a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And the whole thing goes down. You know, or whatever it is that's exactly causing what's happening at the moment, and it's happening all over the place.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't take much for a complex society to kind of cascade into all sorts of problems. And when everybody has become dependent on it, because we can't do anything for ourselves, we can't grow our own food, we can't make our own stuff because all of that's been taken away from us, then we all then also become defenders of the machine because we need it to survive. You know, we might not even like it, but we know that we need to go to the shops, otherwise we're going to starve. So that, you get to that point. But once something gets that complex, it's like, you know, somebody mentioned to me recently, they said, look, this is just the story of the Tower of Babel. You know, this is what we're doing. We're building the Tower of Babel again. You can look in the Old Testament and you can see all of these great myths, and you can look in the, as you say, myths of all sorts of cultures, and they're full of warnings about this because it's always happening. I mean, that's the sort of, if it's a silver lining, that's the silver lining. This is just a large scale version of stuff we're always doing.
Yeah.
You know, it's every civilization that's been built up has fallen apart.
Yeah, it's a sort of, you know, the quote of Ozymandias or whatever it is, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Look upon my works. And,
King of Kings, yes.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, so we're kind of there again, I think. And but that's, if we want to be optimistic, which sometimes it's nice to be, occasionally. Well, not optimistic, just sort of maybe there's a difference between hope and optimism. I don't know, but you know, again, I heard somebody said to me recently, I can't remember who, or I read it somewhere, I lose track of where I get stories from. But you know, it's often in times of crisis or chaos or difficulty when stories become more important and storytellers come into their own, because you've got to tell new stories or rediscover old ones because the ones you're living in are redundant. And one of the things I did when I sort of came out of my crisis of wondering what the hell to do is I started this movement called the Dark Mountain Project in 2009. And that was, I started it with another writer, Dougal Hine, and we wrote a little manifesto called Uncivilization. And the manifesto basically said, look, everything's breaking down. All the stories we're telling ourselves are lies. So as writers and artists, and it was a writers and artists project, what stories would we be telling if we believed that were true? You know, what should we be doing now? Because we're still writing novels and making music as if it were 1990 or 1950 or 1850, when actually we're living through this giant global collapse. What stories would be appropriate? And that's still a really interesting question to me. And the answer isn't just that we should all be telling apocalyptic stories, because those are very old-fashioned too.
Yeah.
But you know, what tales would we tell as creative people, as writers, whoever we are, musicians, anyone, if we thought that the machine is coming down in some way, the stories we grew up with are redundant. If they were ever true, they're not true now. What's a useful thing to do, you know, in a time like that? And it's actually a very interesting question, and it's a potentially optimistic question as well, because it gives you the power to do something. You know, you don't need anyone's permission to do that, to write the music, to write the songs, to tell the stories. And I used to think that was a question of, you know, inventing great new stories for humanity, but I don't think that anymore. I think it's a question of going back to the old ones we forgot about. Because, you know, we're a very old species and we've been telling stories forever. We've got the myths, we've got the religious stories. They all exist for a reason. Yeah. They're all warning us about a tendency within us to endlessly do this stuff. Yeah. So I think as much as anything, it's a question of rediscovering them. Yes, I totally agree with you. Find a way to tell the old stories freshly, because they're eternal. Who was it you said? I think it was Chesterton. He said, all that is not eternal is eternally out of date. It was either Chesterton or C.S. Lewis. I can't remember. They're always saying similar things. But it's a great story. You know, it's a great quote, rather. All that is not eternal is eternally out of date. So you don't need new stories in that sense. You need to find out why we forgot the old ones.
Exactly. And and obviously for a lot of people, when they listen to stories, they think of it intellectually. It's more, it's really not that, is it? It's how it resonates with you.
Yeah, it's the mythic element of it, isn't it? We're talking about myths. The old fairy tales have got so much in them.
Yeah.
The myths have got so much in them. The religious stories from different cultures and traditions have got so much in them, because they're either warnings or they're tales about stuff we've done before. I mean, the story of the flood again is a great one, isn't it? What happens in the flood? Why have we got the Tower of Babel and the flood are the two things that we're basically now repeating again? Right? There's a great flood because of humanity's egotism and refusal to listen to God, and then there's an attempt to literally reach God in the heavens by building an enormous thing so complex that it comes down around us, and we're kind of divided against each other. It's these stories are all they're all there already.
Yeah,
we may be a bit reluctant to imagine that our story was told 3,000 years ago, but it probably was.
Yeah,
and repeats itself.
Yeah, and I mean, really, if you think that, as human beings, how much have we really changed? I mean, as a creature, we've still got deep down very similar things going on. Otherwise, those stories wouldn't be relevant, would they?
I mean, what's interesting is how much we are being changed by the internet at the moment, and I think that's the open question.
I think
how much of our minds are being changed, and how much of that is permanent, and how much is temporary.
Right, that's the thing. It's you could look at sort of programming element of things and go, okay, the internet, that can have that effect. But when push comes to shove, what do you become? When you get down to that thing of everything does start to go wrong, the real you seems to surface somewhere along the line. I've always been fascinated by, obviously, like with music, when you get to that point of being in the flow of something, you're playing, like if you're playing in a band or whatever, and you're not thinking anymore, and there's something else going on, and there is something different happens in those moments, which is almost like must have been the same for people all the way back. Okay, you might not be playing the same type of instrument, but that feeling and again, I've heard this thing with dancers saying the same thing. There's something that sort of connects you back. And I don't know how much the things that we think we've changed, I don't think it's any of that.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, the same thing happens with writing, definitely. I mean, you can always feel when something is flowing through you. The real stuff is written through you. You're a conduit for it.
Yes.
I always tell my writing students this. I always say, the book is a living thing.
Yes.
What you're doing is you're curating a living thing. You're not telling a story. You're delivering a story, and the story wanted to be told, and you're the vessel. So your job is to tell it as well as you can. Get the skills to tell it, but you can always feel it. You can feel it in your body when something's writing itself through you.
Yeah.
And it's almost coming so fast that you have to try and get it down, and you can't keep up with it. And you're right. That's a very old thing, and it comes from a source that is not you. You're a kind of aerial for something. And that's when the electricity goes out. That stuff probably comes back pretty quickly. I would say it's almost like if you stop deforesting the trees, they will cover up your fields in 10 years. It doesn't take long for a forest to grow back again and completely smother the city that was there before. So D.H. Lawrence wrote one of his essays once that human experience had fundamentally changed when the first electric light was switched on. Just the ability to shut out the night with a switch. Changed absolutely everything about the way that we see the world, and it did, I think. But the same would be true if we turn them all off again, or they turn themselves all off again, which they will at some point. We'd have to evolve or devolve pretty quickly again. So, that's my idea of optimism. That is.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because again, the same thing with songs. Songs already exist. That's a great sort of Keith Richards thing of. You just have to hook them in, type of thing. You're part of the process, but it's not you doing it. You're it's flowing through you, and that is definitely something that we need to get back to. And again, that's what I was saying at the beginning with the way that arts are taught in schools. That's a difficult one to mark.
Yeah, well, you can't, can you? I mean,
you can't. No,
it's appalling. And one of the reasons I never studied literature at university, I studied history. I precisely didn't study literature because I liked books, and I knew it would ruin it for me, and it did as well, because I had a girlfriend at college who studied literature and she hated it. She'd gone in there because she liked books. She spent her time, doing critical theory on the texts and analysing this, that, and the other, and it was just, once you've written a novel, you know that the kind of thing academics do to pick it apart is just bullshit of the worst kind. They've no idea how a book's actually written. Yeah. They imagine that you're weaving in any number of themes and critical notions that they're just not there, or if they are there, they're there by accident. But it gives them employment. But it's nothing to do with creativity. You can't teach creativity. You can direct it. You can help people with it. You can help people. I think after years of teaching writers, the thing I realized that's most important is just to give people the confidence to tell the story they want to tell. Yeah. And give them the skills, give them the tools as well, but actually getting people to just believe they're allowed to do it, and that they can do it, and that being a writer isn't this kind of godlike thing. Because it isn't. No one's, what the hell's a writer? I haven't got any qualifications. You just start writing and you're a writer. That's all it is. It's very egalitarian.
I think that's a really important thing, because that's one of the things that you have to say to, I teach people to songwrite, and it's like, well, when do you decide, when are you a songwriter?
Yeah.
When are you a musician? Well, sort of when you've decided that that's what you are, that's what you are. Just do it, type of thing, because nobody's going to come along and give you a badge.
No, you don't get a writer's badge, unfortunately. So it'd be quite cool, wouldn't it? Like a Blue Peter badge.
Yeah, that might be a line that you could work on.
Yes, well, that's true. Yeah, maybe I should run a little course where you get one at the end.
Yeah, like a Blue Peter. It's got to have it's got to be like a little galleon.
Crest on it. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That would.
And I might do the same thing for songwriters. Actually,
I think you should. Yes. Yeah. No, it's needed, definitely.
That's great. So what are you working on at the moment, or are you not working on something?
Well, I was going to write a load of short stories, because I've just, last year I published, I mean, it was published technically, but it came out in the middle of COVID, so no one really noticed. But I published my third novel, which was called Alexandria, and that was the last
of the trilogy
of novels I've been writing since 2014. Which it's the first novel was set during the Norman Conquest, the second one's contemporary, the third one's set in 1,000 years' time, and they're all set in the fens of eastern England, and they trace a kind of one line of people over that time. It's been a fun project, actually.
Yeah.
So the third one of those came out last year, and the paperback's coming out next year. And so after that, I thought I'd write some short stories, which I enjoy doing. So I started doing them, but then I got a bit overtaken by some essays I wanted to write. I wanted to work out what the hell was going on. COVID came along, everything accelerated, and I thought I really need to write about the times we're in. So I've started writing this series of essays on Substack, this platform, which is for essay writers, which is called the Abbey of Misrule. And I'm writing an essay every couple of weeks. I'm trying to trace really the genesis of all the stuff we've been talking about here. What is this machine? Where did it come from? What are its values? What's it doing to us? What can we do about it? I'm trying to take everything I've thought for the last 25 years and put it all into one project, literally, so I don't have to say it again. And the way it works with me, especially with this nonfiction stuff, is that it buzzes around in my head and it sort of fills me up. And at some point, my wife says, "Will you please go and write this down because you're unbearable?" So, so I have to go and do it. I can't walk around the house muttering to myself anymore. I have to go and get it out on paper. So that's what I'm doing. And when I finish that, I'm going to see if I can write some stories again. But I'm trying to work my way through where we are really and how we got here, and what's wrong with this value system. I'm trying to take everything we've just talked about and see if I can, in some ways, sort of categorize it for myself as much as anyone, so that I can work out exactly what I think. It's a really interesting thing to try and do. It's a bit stupidly ambitious, but it helps me at the moment because the world's going mad, and so I'm trying to work out what the hell is happening for my own satisfaction as much as anything.
Yeah. There was just one point. There seems to be a little bit of a theme about you publishing books and some sort of crisis. Either it's the Twin Towers or COVID or something. So I was going to say, perhaps you should let everybody know when you're going to produce another book.
When my next one's coming out. The best thing for me to do would be to not write any more books, and then I wouldn't cause any trouble.
I'm just wondering, which, is there going to be another Horseman of the Apocalypse turning up?
Well, that's quite likely, but hopefully it won't be my fault.
No, absolutely not. No, it's brilliant. Well, Paul, that's magnificent. That's such a great chat.
It's been a great chat. You can talk about these things for weeks, can't you?
Of course you can.
It's been really interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So we need, obviously, I'm going to put stuff on the show notes so people can find out what you're up to.
Okay, that would be great.
Have you got? Yeah, I know you've got a website and stuff, haven't you? You do that sort of thing.
I've got a website. It's out there. That's it, really. I have a little Facebook page which I occasionally put things on, but I don't do social media because it drives me and everybody else mad. So I don't need that in my life. So no, try and keep it as calm as possible.
Yeah, that's good. But there's a great chat, and well, hopefully one day might be able to sort of meet you in the
when we're allowed out. That'll be great.
Exactly, because we had a little bit of an aborted attempt at meeting up.
Yeah, no, that would be good. I hope that happens. But we need to sit around a fire and tell stories, I think.
Yes,
that's the absolutely. Way it should be.
Sing songs and
exactly. Yes,
that's great.
Bring your guitar.
Oh, I'll do my best. All right, that's been great. Thanks ever so much.
No problem.
Cheers. So big thanks to Paul. All the details will be on the show notes. Check out his work because it is really fabulous. And there'll be some stuff on there, obviously, about the charity and Blues Camp and all the other stuff that I'm doing. So until next time, see you then.